Marcel Fratscher does everything, and I mean really everything, to completely embarrass himself from start to finish. Just imagine, if prices fall now, then groceries will get more expensive. At first I thought, this has to be satire, this must be April Fool's. It must have been April Fool's, but no, it was just yesterday. Just a quick question. If you want to support this channel, I would really appreciate a like and a subscription. So, that's the end of the ad, and let's get right into it this morning. I have to say, I've never heard so much incompetence in my life.
Tax relief for gasoline and diesel is actually a counterproductive measure.
So, do you have any good tips? Are you going to give us some really good advice right now on what else should be done to relieve the burden on the population? I mean, let's be honest, those 17 cents were already added to the fuel prices yesterday at exactly 12 o'clock. So he's not entirely wrong about that, but the conclusion he's about to draw, I could just bang my head on the table.
Drivers are now being relieved, which means they won't save as much gasoline and diesel as would be necessary.
Yes, but I thought it wasn't even necessary for us to save fuel. I thought Katharina Reich had never lied to us and that what she said was really true. We don't have any shortage, it's just gotten a bit more expensive. Oh, right. The Strait of Hormuz is now closed too, but there is no shortage in Germany, neither for natural gas nor gasoline. So let's just keep using it indefinitely. That's just how I would think about it. If there really is no shortage here in Germany, but the conclusion that's coming now, even I had to swallow hard when he said that.
In order to cope with the lower supply of fossil energy sources. That necessarily means that somewhere else, especially with food, prices will rise even more.
So now we really need to talk straight. If gas prices become cheaper and supply chains remain intact because there is definitely no shortage, quote unquote, then food prices will become more expensive because the producers or the retailers manage to transport goods from A to B more cheaply. Someone should please explain to me how anyone can come up with such, well, I have to say such nonsense, honestly. No, the prices will either remain stable or just become slightly cheaper than they would actually be with this tax on top. Unless, however, there are such big budget shortfalls that you have to tax other things more. For example, there's the tax that's now being removed for 2 months, but there's also a completely new tax, or rather, a completely new tax increase on tobacco and alcohol. That definitely stays, of course, to fill the gap, but they didn't tell you that yesterday. That this tax, the alcohol and tobacco tax, won't just disappear again, but of course it will stay. To definitely fill the budget shortfalls better than with unconstitutional interactions of debt. And even there, leading economists now, and I don't mean someone like Fratscher, have said, well, I'd be a bit careful with that. If beer consumption in Germany now collapses and at the same time also tobacco consumption, because many people are no longer willing to bear it, then we'll have an even bigger problem and the gaps will get even larger. But our federal government simply doesn't care about that at all.
And many people who work for small businesses, for the shop around the corner or the bakery, simply can't afford to pay their employees 1,000 euros. No.
So I definitely agree with you on that point. That goes for food as well. I once paid attention in economics class, and I know that when fuel prices go up, you lower taxes. That theoretically, this actually stimulates the economy. But that food prices will rise when fuel prices or energy prices go down. Because they also want to adjust the electricity taxes, but then food prices will go up. And that people who mainly spend on food are not being relieved either. So at some point, either I must have skipped that particular class with such a specific example, which I can't really imagine because I was always there, and it was a topic that always fascinated me. But as I said, that €1,000 payment, yes, what will cause discontent? Namely, the people who get it once compared to the people who don't get it. And that's when they talk about it somewhere among relatives and friends, because there are small companies that simply can't actually pay out that €1,000 payment. They have completely different problems, like the fact that more and more people are becoming unemployed here in Germany and more businesses will simply close down. But I agree with you on that point, but the thing about groceries is just completely far-fetched. However, he doesn't give us any reason anywhere as to why things should be like that. He probably once, on April 1st, with that strange law they passed, maybe just had a little too much to smoke that evening. That could be possible.
It's hard to understand because we actually know, or at least the politicians should know, how it works.
That's right. First of all, completely get rid of the carbon tax. We're not meeting the climate goals anyway. Immediately, overnight, the government should know that. At the same time, this government should already give us a sign by the end of the year. Up to an income of XY, I'm not going to say a number here, 50,000 a year, 70,000 a year tax exemption. Completely through, yes, also for employees. That really makes a difference, I have to say. That really makes a difference with the value added tax in the other area. You would really benefit from that at first. And of course, to really take it up a notch, yes, I would also go ahead and simply cut vehicle tax. That's mainly done for diesel vehicles so that at the end of the year they have to pay less tax because they have to buy gasoline at such a high price. And just like that, people with low incomes would benefit right away. They wouldn't have to pay high taxes anymore. On the other hand, energy costs would have been reduced and reduced significantly. And whether you would still absolutely need the antitrust authority, I don't think so, because there wouldn't be so many risk surcharges anymore. But yes, for that you would have to implement broad tax cuts. Then, of course, you would have to save a bit more in other areas like the Demokratie-Leben program or something like that. And then, or ideologically driven climate projects in Saudi Arabia, for example, buying refrigerators there right in the middle of the savannah. Those projects would need to be scaled back. We would also have to save about as much on Ukraine as, let's say, the same share that France pays compared to our gross national product. Yes, or gross domestic product in this case, and just like that, everything would be fully paid for. And yes, it's really not any simpler or more complex than that.
You're not subsidizing driving and the price of gasoline here, which is exactly what the federal government did with that one measure. Instead, you get money, and the driver who lives in the countryside where there is no public transportation and who depends on a car can take that money, those €300, and say, I need this for gas.
Mr. Fratscher, how can you even sleep peacefully at night? And does it really hurt to say what you're saying right now? If every person here in Germany, let's say, received €300, yes, every person equally, then the person in the countryside would say, okay, theoretically, I would have to spend more on gas than someone who takes the bus. I need the money now for gas. The mother who stays at home and does nothing because she's taking care of her children, she gets these 300 €300 as well, might not even have a car. That's really quality, of course. Meanwhile, and that's what he did, it's a great example, so he was referring to 22, and on the other hand, inflation is rising and getting even worse. By the way, back then, several research institutes actually published that if you give relief once, for example, with €300 from the government, that this would actually drive up inflation more quickly. And secondly, this would even generate more tax revenue. Why? Because I would say low-income families here in Germany would increase their purchasing power with this. And, well, where does most of the money go? Well, to the tax authorities and not to the retailers, to the business owners, etc. So what he's demanding here is pure inflation-driven market economy, and he still believes in his own nonsense that he's talking about.
I can only speculate and assume it's an expensive tool. Back then, that cost the federal government nearly €10 billion. They probably didn't want to spend that much money.
No, because they didn't look for real experts. We said nothing remained. It pushed the inflation rate even higher and brought in even more tax revenue. And secondly, this is something that later ended up in the coffers of the current administration. You can't just declare another state of emergency when everyone is playing along. And that's exactly why they decided not to do it. Do it because in fact it doesn't achieve anything except that prices rise exponentially when the government has to intervene again and again just to, let's say, keep prices stable. That's the big knockout system he's calling for again, which is then called a socially just market economy as it stands today. No one can afford it anymore, and that's why the market has to regulate itself and we have to give people some relief.
So it's not a question of price, but rather a question of how we can Verbrauch, reduce consumption, subsidizing drivers and saying you get extra money so that gasoline doesn't become quite so expensive leads to people not cutting back on driving as much as would be necessary.
Necessary to save the climate or necessary to keep global trade stable? Please explain that to us. By the way, all the claims he made, he never actually backed up with facts. I just wonder why that is. He always presented that as the status quo, and that's exactly the problem. All those claims he threw out there, except for the one about the 1,000 euros, he basically messed up completely. But the fact that he's not exactly a top economist is something he's proven time and again in the past. The question is, do you want to use climate ideology to get people to buy electric cars in order to boost this economy? Do you want to get people to stop driving cars and switch to public transportation because you think the climate will collapse next week and we'll all be sitting in the dark? Then the assumption he made is correct, and really only from that point of view. But since we don't really know exactly what will happen with the climate, maybe we should focus on that for now. Just like the Americans, not necessarily to save the climate, but to save this economy. Because at the latest, when the economy is completely ruined anyway, then nobody here needs to worry about the climate anymore. Because then heavy battle tanks will be driving around to somehow keep these people calm for the sake of the economy. That's it from me this morning. This morning there was a statement from Fratscher, and I already thought to myself, oh man, how can people out there even believe that?